You, Robin, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining from. We're so appreciative of your taking the time to be here at what may sometimes be odd hours for you, but I think it's going to be well worth your time. My name is Chandni Navalka. I'm Associate Director for Sustainably Managed Land and Water Resources at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and together with our small but mighty team here based in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the United States, we lead the International Land Conservation Network. And we're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the third in a webinar series that ILCN and the Australian Land Conservation Alliance have co-organized, enabling conservation in a rapidly changing world. This webinar series is based on the 2025 Churchill Fellowship report, published a few months ago, written by Jody Gunn, based on her time in the US and Canada last year with us. And you'll hear from Jody and a wonderful panel of speakers today on some of the key insights on the practice of conservation, which is the focus of today's session. So with that, I will turn it over to Jody Gunn, CEO of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, to get us started here with a wonderful conversation today. Jody, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chandni, for the introduction, and also to the International Land Conservation Network for co-hosting this webinar series with us. Thank you all for joining from right around the world at all times of day. It's morning where I am on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, known as Naarm or Melbourne, in the southern state of Victoria, Australia. And I acknowledge the deep and long-term connection that Australia's First Nations people have with this country, one of the biggest connected cultures existing with and being responsible for country for over 60,000 years. People's connection to place is fundamental to achieving environmental outcomes, and this connection is no more profound than through the eyes and the experiences of Australia's First Nations peoples. From a young child, I have had a passion for wildlife, and that has carried through my career, where my underlying purpose has been to protect the unique species and the ecosystems right across the globe, from elephants and baboons in the savanna plains of Africa to bettongs and dunnarts in rangeland Australia. However, despite the distances that I've travelled and the ecosystems that I've researched, core to how I've engaged in this pursuit has been in understanding the relationships of people and place, exploring the dynamics and influences that shape people's interactions with wildlife and their impacts on this planet that we share. This interest, this curiosity, combined with my continuous drive to keep advancing our practice, has inspired me to complete a Churchill Fellowship, a unique opportunity to be supported to travel globally, to learn from others, and to bring those learnings back to my work and life in Australia, to continue to grow the organisation that I lead today, the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, that is scaling the protection, management and restoration of nature. And so on planes and trains, cars and buses, I travelled from Quebec to Boston, from Washington to Missoula, from Bozeman to San Francisco. I met incredible people doing inspiring and amazing things, and I made and solidified friendships that I hope last a lifetime. I observed the rapid rate of change that came from a significant federal election. And after the travel was over, I returned home, I reflected, and I completed a report. And this webinar series is about bringing that report to life, about sharing the incredible people that I met with all of you, about unleashing their stories, their learnings, and their innovations so that we can all learn, be inspired, and continue to progress our shared agenda. So, as Chandni has said, this is the last of a three-part series. In the first webinar, we tapped into the funding and finance landscape. We unpacked the important role of conservation finance networks that are gaining momentum around the world, and we flipped the lid on some specific finance initiatives. In the second webinar, we dived deeply into the role of alliances around the world, the role that they play in platforms for collaboration, the initiatives they deliver to build capacity, and their critical role in advocacy and mobilising voices for nature. Today, in this last discussion, we'll explore what's happening on the ground, be inspired by the impact of conservation organisations, understand how they are protecting, managing and connecting our natural environment and engaging with the communities around which they operate. We'll begin to understand some of the enabling factors that can scale their work and how they build resilient organisations in rapidly changing times. So I'm super lucky to be joined today by an incredible panel. We have Deb Davison from the Centre for Large Landscape Conservation, Sharon Farrell from the Californian Landscape Stewardship Network, Chet Work from the Gallatin Valley Land Trust, and unfortunately today, Madeline Betancourt, who was meant to be joining us today, has come down unwell. Our thoughts are with her, and she is from the Ramapo-Munsee Land Alliance, and we wish her a speedy recovery. So with this incredible panel, by way of introducing yourselves, can you describe your organisation, its purpose, and maybe share an achievement or impact that you've had in recent times? Maybe we start with you, Chad, and then go to Deb and Sharon.
Thank you so much, Jody. Hope you can hear me. I'm going to share my screen real quick. My name is Chet Work. I am the director of a small non-governmental organization in the United States. We're located in the mountainous region in the center of the country. You can see the icon here. We're actually just north of Yellowstone National Park in the state of Montana. As a land trust, we have a mission to conserve important private lands, and we do so on the periphery of these public lands. Yellowstone National Park is known for its beauty, as are the valleys that surround it. This is one of those valleys, and you can see Yellowstone in the distance in those white peaks. But the value of these private lands is of critical importance. And what we know about Yellowstone is that the wildlife cannot survive there year-round, and that in the winter they descend on the private lands. Failure to conserve these private lands is a failure to conserve these iconic species that we attribute to the national park. So our work is to work with these private landowners and to secure these lands. To date, about 30,000 hectares of land in this landscape has been conserved by my organization over the past 30 years. We also work within our community to create trails and recreation opportunities for our community. And we like to say that recreation in this community is what brings the community together. Trails build friendships. To date, about 160 kilometers of trails have been created in and around the city of Bozeman, Montana, where we're located. And of significant interest to me is a really iconic project that we're working on, what I consider to be a globally important conservation property. It's about 3,200 hectares immediately adjacent to the national park. The property is home to, at times, 15 to 20 brown bears, as we call them, grizzly bears, but is also working ranch. And you can see in this image twin calves associated with the mama cow in the back, twin cubs associated with a grizzly bear just off the frame. This is a working landscape that is of critical importance to both bears and cattle. This is why I'm interested in this work, is the opportunity to work on big, globally significant ranches. I'll stop sharing. Thanks, Jody.
Thanks, Chet. Deb, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Deb Davidson. I'm also based in Bozeman, Montana. So I'm just down the street from Chet. And I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for an organization called the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and had the pleasure to show Jody around some of our projects here in the region, and then also some in other regions in northeastern North America. And CLLC, which is our acronym, we were founded to be a leader and a proponent of taking a large landscape approach to conservation, one that considers the movement of wildlife across entire regions and takes into account the complexities of working across multi-jurisdictional and across borders and across cultures. So this fit right in with our work, fits really nicely in with Jody's fellowship work. And we work across the US and the globe to secure connected and resilient landscapes for healthy communities, people, and wildlife. And we really see this as one of the most pressing conservation challenges that we're taking on, and that's increasing human development and increasing fragmentation across the globe. We see it here in the United States, you see it in Australia. We really see it in countries like in countries within South America and Africa too. And so that's what we work on, addressing that fragmentation, including from roads and railways. And we have a team of scientists and conservation planners who work with partners across the globe to do that. So one thing that I am particularly proud of right now is within Montana, which has been a little slow to work on the idea of wildlife crossings. We've had some, but not nearly as much leadership as we have seen in other surrounding states or other states across the country. We had 2 bills passed this year and signed by our governor. There was just a celebration 2 days ago where my staff was at, really highlighting, and this is our first dedicated funding to wildlife crossings that the state will be putting money up for. So huge cultural shift that we've been working on since I have been working on conservation here for 25 years. And so really proud of that. Baby steps, but those baby steps are really important right now, for sure. So thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Deb. Thanks for sharing that and congratulations. All steps are really important right now. So congratulations. Sharon, you'd like to introduce yourself?
Well, thanks for having me join, Jody. And I'm the outlier. I'm from California. I'm from further west of the Montana area. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. My name is Sharon Farrell. My background is as a restoration ecologist. And I currently work for an organization called the Stewardship Network. I'm their strategic advisor, and really what we focus on is how do we help connect those who are doing the practice of stewardship. We provide them with the resources they need, and we mobilize and activate them in a way that expands the way we care for land and water. And this hat that I'm wearing today is of one of the sister networks. So being from California, I'm speaking today as a member of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. To give you a sense of context, there are about 40 place-based stewardship-focused networks cross-boundary, some of them over 1 million acres, some of them smaller. And they make up about 60% of the state. And we're all practitioners. We have a background in the practice of caring for land. We're volunteer-based. We do have a paid coordinator we're very grateful for. And our approach is really around problem solving, around the barriers that limit us working at the pace, the scale, the quality that we're seeking to do stewardship work in the state of California, and frankly, beyond. We do this through building capacity and supporting that capacity for those place-based networks. We bring a statewide voice, and we really focus on the movement building of our practice, as well as the improvement of the practices themselves by promoting new thinking, change, and action. And Jody, you asked for something that I'm proud of, and it's funny, normally I would tell you something that's place-based, but just recently, a colleague of mine and I finished 8 months of research that really centers on creation of a new model. And the model really is around collaborative capacity and impact. We have struggled as a field of practice to develop the correlation between the capacity needed and the actions we undertake on the ground. And so that's been my body of work for the last 8 months. And I can share a little bit more about that in the context of what does it mean for us then as land stewards or ocean stewards in our work.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sharon. And I'm look forward to understanding a little bit more about that as we continue the conversation, and congratulations on getting that work done. Chet, I'd love to go back to you thinking about protecting and stewarding land. I love the way your organisation has adapted and grown with local context, how you've lent into that community need. Can you let us know how the Gallatin Valley Land Trust began and evolved, and some of the key initiatives that you deliver in service of the environment and community? And, if you can expand on the role of easements.
Sure. Thanks, Jody. I guess I would start by saying there are about 1,200 land trusts in the United States, and it is a really critical way that we are working outside of regulatory mechanisms or governments or municipalities to help conserve primarily private lands. Total, I think it's 61 million acres. That's probably 25 million hectares in the United States have been conserved by private land conservation organizations, not governmental organizations. So almost the amount of acreage that is enclosed in our national parks has been privately conserved by land trusts. That's pretty impressive. I think the best part about it is that land trusts are of the community. They are disparate from one another, but they are very adaptive to their community. So there are land trusts in the country that are focused on um, historic structures, battlefields, indigenous lands. There are land trusts that are focused solely on agriculture, solely on barns, covered bridges, scenic facades in urban areas, but they are of their community. And what I would say is that the Gallatin Valley Land Trust was formed around two things, and that was the preservation of agricultural habitat and the creation and preservation of recreation opportunities. And we have bound ourselves with those two things, trails and conservation, as we call them, and it's created a really remarkable asset for our community. I think when we deliver on land conservation, Jody, as you mentioned, we're talking about writing what we in the United States call conservation easements with private landowner families. And these are legal agreements that limit the type and amount of development that can occur on the property. Typically, they all eliminate minerals development, they all eliminate sort of clear-cut forestry, anything that would have a significant impact on the scenic or habitat qualities of the property, but they don't limit agriculture and they don't necessarily eliminate all home development. Obviously, broad scale subdivision and residential development would be eliminated. Um, but they are a wonderful tool to use with private landowners because they cater to the individual family, and that family can retain the needs that they want and give up the uses that would impact the habitat and community benefits of the property. And I love them. Every single one of them is individually tailored and it's really creative. If I had to have a career of writing the exact same agreement over and over again, I would have retired a long time ago. It's wonderful to be able to cater these to each family and their needs. And they've been successful across the country so far.
That's fantastic. And, I think what you're describing there as well is just the way that the different values that landholders put on the role of easements can vary vastly, which is so interesting that they can adapt in that way. How have you built, Chet, that community of support around your work? Is it because you've got these tools that can be tailored, or what are the other ways that you've built that community of support?
Well, I think the easements are wonderful for families, if they, there's sort of two reasons that they engage in them. One is that each and every one of those families has an interest in the perpetual protection of their family legacy and of the resources on their property. I've had landowners say that they trust their kids, but they don't really know their grandkids, and they certainly don't know their great grandkids, and they want to make sure that they can rule their property from the grave. So it's that controlling mechanism that really wonderful land stewards want to have to make sure no one messes up the legacy that they leave. The other part is this is a great way for some agricultural families to access equity in their property that they wouldn't be able to access without selling the land outright. And so by selling these easements, they still retain ownership and control, but they can access some of that funding. And that allows them to transfer these lands to the next generation. I feel like what has allowed us to really engage with the community is the balance, Jody, between offering access and recreation to certain places, which the community cherishes and embraces, and also recognizing that some places aren't for that access and recreation. And those are private farm fields and ranches. You don't walk through the cattle pasture, you don't walk through the bison pasture. But a recognition that we're bringing our community to the land in some places and that we're alluding to the perpetual conservation of resources in other places, I think is the right balance for our community. And if we locked up a bunch of land with private landowners and never let the community out there, I don't think we'd have that embrace. If we were only about trails and we weren't achieving actual habitat conservation, I don't think we'd have the same embrace. So it's the balance of those two uses that I think engages our community best.
Yeah, fantastic. The easements one of the kind of primary tools, or are there other innovations in practice that are engaging the communities and you've touched as well on particularly the farming communities?
We work a lot on engaging with our landowners to help them manage their property. So what we would call enhanced stewardship of their land. we often bring rare connections that they don't seek out themselves. I think holistic and sustainable farming is something that Montana ranchers are apt to ignore. But oftentimes, if they've engaged with us on a conservation easement, we can deliver some of those concepts and skills. We can help them find a forestry technician. We can send them to timber school. We can bring up the idea of wetlands that do more than enhance a fishery, that enhance birds. So I think that there's a little bit of that we can drive through the relationships that we build. I think that there is a lot around I just think bringing landowners to a bigger concept. I think a lot of landowners think only to their boundary and are apt not to try and tell their neighbors what to do in this state. And that bigger vision, the work that Deb's group is doing on wildlife migration corridors, the science that they bring about the value of a property to a larger network of properties, I think is a good resource that we can bring to landowners.
Yeah, fantastic. And we'll go to some of that in a moment. But you also touch on stewardship. Chet, you talk about protecting and managing, shifting to the stewardship side of things. Sharon, in California, you described your network has been making some really big achievements. And one of those is towards the 30 by 30 target. So protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030. And at a state level in California, they're making some ground. Can you describe that target and the outcomes and the impact of a recent forum held that demonstrates continued and scaled efforts to achieve that necessary and ambitious target?
Sure. And, 2 weeks ago, for those of you joining, I had the privilege to be a part of a convening, which our state does annually for what we call our 30 by 30 Partnership Summit. And this year we had well over 500 individuals who expressed interest. It was one of those events, I think right now at this time, people are they have a need and seeking opportunities to connect. We're seeing it more and more, and not just connect, but find moments of joy and hope and affirmation of the work we're doing and the importance and value of it. So having come off of that, yeah, I feel like being in California also, I'm maybe a little bit of an anomaly. I'll just say that out loud. In our country right now, we have strong state leadership. We have commitments being stated towards achieving these goals. We have staff, we have grants. So I feel very fortunate, frankly. And this was our halfway point celebration. And we have achieved, from a lands perspective, conserving 26.1% of California, which was about 26.5 million acres. It's huge. It's a big and lofty goal. Coastal waters were about 21.9%. So again, 760,000 plus acres. And that takes commitment, and that takes broad participation, that takes many tools. And I think one of the things I was reflecting on this conversation is I feel that our state, the way we've set up our approach, is really in that movement building mode. Chet, you spoke to kind of durability, right, through conservation easements. We're thinking a lot about durability from shared ownership. How do we as Californians, whether we are a part of a land trust, whether we are a National Park Service biologist, whether we are a tribal member, have some sense of relationship, relevance, and ownership to the longevity of this work? And from kind of a structural perspective, the way our state set up the 30 by 30 work was to create a partnership model, which the state is not necessarily the one responsible for all of it. It's a shared endeavor. We have a coordinating committee, which is made up of non-government organizations, including land trusts, resource conservation districts. We've got councils and networks. We've got partnerships with tribes throughout the state and regional working groups and coalitions and networks like mine. And I think that is in part feeding into its long-term success. It's not owned by one individual, it's owned. And because of that, similar to what Chet was saying, there are conversations about access. There are conversations about climate adaptation. All of these are being integrated into the umbrella of what 30 by 30 as a movement is representing for our state. So when you think about, or when I think about the role of the California Landscape Stewardship Network, we're about the how. The how do we get the work done, which many others are, land trusts and others. And I think where we feel we've made perhaps some of the stronger contributions is this notion of multi-benefit approaches. We're in a state, as many of you probably know, that has faced and is facing significant wildfire impacts, just like Australia and many parts of the Mediterranean climates. So we can't think of 30 by 30 absent of wildfire resilience, absent of forest health. We think of our work, and we've been championing landscape scale approaches. Deb spoke to the wildlife corridors, but we believe that we can't undertake the stewardship practices that we need without doing it across boundary, across sector, and across culture. And that means identifying also what are the barriers that limit us, what are the levers within the system of those barriers that we can pull to innovate new solutions. So our network approaches this in partnership with the state, in partnership with many of the others that contribute. And we are then seeking to undertake work at a system scale. And what I mean by that, an example of that, is we as stewardship practitioners for quite some time have recognized that the environmental laws that we have developed, which are so important to our work, are also limiting at times to beneficial restoration work, beneficial stewardship activities, especially at the scales needed. So we worked in partnership with the state to create an initiative called Cutting Green Tape. And Cutting Green Tape really is about how do we modify, change, develop new ways of working in that regulatory framework, in that culture framework, to enable us to increase the quality and the pace and the scale of beneficial restoration. An example of a bold move I think our state made was to say, we will create an exemption under our environmental laws for beneficial restoration that is being undertaken as you look at the CEQA, California's Environmental Quality Act. And that takes trust, and that takes commitment, and that takes constant evaluation. But it's things like that that, again, under that umbrella of how do we weave this together to undertake this work in a way that is benefiting the practice and the scale of environmental stewardship.
That's fantastic. So many threads there, Sharon. I love the picture of government working in partnership with NGOs, local communities to achieve the 30 by 30 and that shared ownership of that objective. And I think there's a real opportunity, for all states, territories, countries to really think about that collaborative need to share the ownership of achieving that goal. That's really fantastic. And Cutting Green Tape is certainly something we've been, looking at, that you've been delivering and have delivered for some time. Really fantastic. To hear some more about those two initiatives. You also touched on connectivity. So Deb, the Centre for Large Landscapes Conservation, you've described to us, it's a leader in connectivity globally. Can you describe the importance of connectivity and how it's being delivered across the US, both through collaborative landscape level partnerships as well as physical infrastructure that you touched on?
Yeah, small question. So I was actually going to read to you the official definition of ecological connectivity, because I think it's worth knowing that the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity adopted an official definition, and that is ecological connectivity is the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. Yeah, it's a little clunky, but terms we also hear thrown around are wildlife corridors, ecological connectivity, obviously, habitat linkages, and permeable landscapes. And they all essentially mean the same thing, or at least have the similar focus. And that's to ensure that and allow for the ability of animals to be able to move across landscapes. And also, so ecological processes can continue. And that could be a healthy river continuing to be able to flow, or a riparian area serving its purpose for cleaning water. But it's really that idea. And then ultimately, connected habitats are much more resilient to climate change, and they're also really good for human communities. And we need them to thrive. So that's where I think this intersection with the work that Chet's doing and the work that Sharon's doing kind of all comes together. So our work specifically in the United States has been focused on both some iconic landscapes here in the Northern Rockies, increasingly in the Appalachians, to really champion both this idea of reconnecting habitat. Often that's what we're looking at in a place like the United States, where we're actually having to do restoration to ensure that connected lands can be reconnected, and or lands that were severed can be reconnected. And that can happen through wildlife crossings, which is an area that we've definitely put a lot of our attention in here in the United States. That also can be working with partners like Chet, where we help identify high priority lands that could be conserved for wildlife movement, or for healthy ecological processes. So I was going to give you a few examples. We do have a policy focus. We also have a connectivity science focus. So we have worked at scale across the United States, working here in our own backyard at the county level, working at the state level in Montana and elsewhere. I referenced that legislative win. We have had wins like that across the country, and working with partners and legislators to actually bring connectivity conservation to a state level. So either passing wildlife corridors acts or passing policies that may fund this kind of work. Then we also worked at the federal level, particularly with the Biden administration, and actually even Trump 1.0 and prior to that, on embracing this idea that taking a large landscape approach is crucial, like looking across borders, looking across boundaries. The federal government has really, had pretty robust programs around landscape conservation, wildlife migration, as well as wildlife crossing. So we've been involved at those multi-levels. But I was just going to highlight, this might give a little, I know you want us to give us some more tangible examples, so I will. Here in Montana, one of the ways that this has played out is our partnership with the Department of Transportation. And we have fine-tuned our connectivity science and provided fine-scale assessments, so 100-mile long sections of roadways where we've done wildlife and transportation assessments based on field data, animal presence, habitat suitability, but most importantly, based on wildlife vehicle collision data, and been able to then use that to help identify, let's use this 100-mile stretch of road to the west of me, identify 11 priority sites that would be appropriate for wildlife crossings. And then we have delivered that to the Montana Department of Transportation, and we're working with them to move some of those forward. Of course, there's very limited resources for that right now, and those are long games. But what that information, those maps, and Chet alluded to it, also help us to then move into private lands conservation too. So we narrowed down this 100-mile stretch of roadway, and using the many data layers and technical advisory committees input, we're able to say, okay, these 11 sites, what's the land ownership on those? Is it federal? Great, that makes it a lot easier. Oh, is it private? Well, is it secured? And if this is really a high priority for wolves, grizzlies, elk, we need to then work with partners like Chet or Montana Land Reliance or others to figure out how can we conserve those lands. Work with the landowners is obviously the prime thing. So it helps us. So our assessments, in the case of Montana, are helping to narrow down where we should put our resources. And we know we have limited resources for conservation, and we can't protect everything. And from our perspective, because connectivity is such a major problem, we have to kind of figure out, where are the highest priority areas that we can protect right now to ensure there is movement. So I'll leave it at that for that one, Jody. And then I think
and just on that, so you talk about some of these physical connectivity infrastructure. Why are they becoming successful? What is it that's attracting, governments and others to secure the funds you've been securing, or the bills that you need to pass to enable these to happen? What's attracting, governments and others to get involved in now delivering on these?
I've started working on like the idea of wildlife corridors, connected habitats 25 years ago, and like you could talk to most people and they would have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, this topic has really come of age, and it's partially because of the people on the screen here and other partners that we work with and our organization. We push pretty hard to make the case that if you want to continue to have wildlife populations, if we want to have healthy landscapes, we have to address some of this. And from the road ecology perspective, which is what we call it, the wildlife vehicle collision, the linear infrastructure impediments that these physical barriers provide, it's also a human safety issue. And so that actually is one of the reasons I think it has gained so much traction too, is because it's horrible to hit an animal. And it's both horrible from a mental perspective, but it's also really scary from a physical perspective. In a place like Montana, you hit an elk, it could do a lot of damage. And so I think that there's a couple like dual purposes. We also have seen, a real uptick in the past 25 years around the recognition that, big game is a really important component to our world. Wildlife has a really important role. I think we kind of are riding the wave of this increased recognition of the role of nature in our lives. So we've actually seen this be a very bipartisan issue, partially because partners like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation who have embraced this and kind of championed it too, from the perspective of, do you want your mule deer and your elk to still be here? Well, then let's work together. It has been a very bipartisan issue. Wyoming, for instance, has been one of the leaders on this. Not a state that you often think of as being super progressive, but they realized that the wildlife values in their state were worth investing in. And as a result, they said, okay, one of our biggest loss of wildlife is wildlife vehicle collisions. And it's either the fact that their animals are physically being killed on the road, or the road is acting as a physical barrier because of traffic volume. So it's taken off. From a federal perspective, we had in the last surface transportation bill, bipartisan infrastructure bill, we had our first standalone funding pot for wildlife crossings called the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program. It's been phenomenally successful. There's still one more year to be allocated, and we're waiting for it. But it proved that there's an appetite across this country. And I mean, almost not every state, but most states have received some funding to do work on wildlife crossings now. Maryland, they're doing a statewide assessment on their highest priority wildlife crossings. New York is doing the same thing. North Carolina got like 20+ million to do wildlife crossings in a really rural area for red wolves and for other species. So it's taken off. But I think part of it is human safety, value of nature, and particularly, big game. But then it's also, I think that there's something about that bipartisan, like we can do something togetherness that has helped too.
Yes, so interesting, and I think we'll get more broadly to other kind of levers and enabling factors for the other work. But I've got one more question, because you talked about the different land tenures and some make it easy, some make it harder, how you engage. So what role do local community play in ensuring these projects can, you're talking about big infrastructure, can actually be a success, from landholders to tribal communities?
You can't do this work without having at least the local partners who are connected to the local community moving it forward. I mean, as a science team, like we can do the science and identify those priority spots, but that's just a report if you don't have the partners on the ground who want to do something with it and are able to make something of it. So in the case of, here, like one of our key partners is Montana Department of Transportation, but then that filters down to also the local community. In the case, it's, the Big Sky community, the Four Corners community. And then of course it's our partners like Land Trust who are so critical. So, I mean, working at a large landscape, it's all about partnerships and making sure you got the right people at the table. And yeah, which makes it really hard. I mean, connectivity conservation is really hard because it's multi-jurisdictional. And it's really requires working at many scales. It could be working on one 20-acre parcel with Chet, or it could be all the way up to trying to get federal funding, like all the way in between. So that landscape, or that locally led or local involvement at least, is crucial.
Yeah, and speaking of complexity, you're all working in very complex and interesting times over there at the moment. I was over there for my study tour during the election, before, during it, and shortly after. And during that tour, I engaged with all manner of conservation organisations, and there were common challenges experienced by many: funding constraints, land use pressures, managing a wide diversity of stakeholders, legal and policy barriers, many of which they hadn't yet realised might be about to occur. And on the flip side, also some common opportunities that organisations I met with were talking of: strengthening partnerships, public engagement and education, and advocacy for policy support. So I'd love to unpack these enabling factors with you all, and what's been really critical to scale the conservation practice, the area around which you're working on. So Chet, maybe back to you, as a land trust. How do you create resilience in your organisation in the wake of challenging times, constant change? We've had political changes before, they'll come again. What have been the keys to your long-term success?
It's a good question, and I wouldn't say that probably any organization starts out with the end in mind. I think you got to bounce off a few obstacles before you find your stability. My organization, we probably do 15 to $20 million worth of conservation in any given year. The biggest funding source for that until this year has been the United States Department of Agriculture. We receive funding to keep farms and ranches from the federal farm bill, to keep those farms and ranches in productivity, in operation, to not have them get swallowed up by residential development and urban growth. And we've become really expert at soliciting those funds and deploying them. What I will tell you is that there's lots of other sources that we can use. They tend not to be as large or easy, and that's why we focused in on those farm bill funds. But as the Trump administration and the changes in our federal government are sort of reverberating around funding, we're figuring out where else we can look. What I would tell you is that we tend to not fund our team with those federal funds. We tend to use those funds to fund the projects, to compensate landowners for the conservation easements that we're buying. And the reason we don't fund our team with that is because the greatest asset our organization has walks in and out of the front door every day, and that is the people who are doing the work. And so if we can use our local fundraising, we raise about $3 million a year in this community from people who care about the work, and we funnel that into the people who write the federal grants and who leverage the private dollars against public resources. What happens when those public resources dry up or they change? You still have really talented, really smart and creative people who can find the next solution. You can imagine that the work that we do takes a lot of time. Trying to get a conservative farmer or rancher in this part of the United States to agree to take money, they're very suspect, they're very worried, they're very skeptical of the way this works. It takes a lot of trust, and we are sometimes in a relationship with landowners for a decade before we can consummate one of these real estate transactions. If we're changing out our staff in less than 5 years, we will lose all those relationships with families and landowners. If our care for the protected properties after we've protected them, if we don't send a similar person out there every year, the landowners lose confidence in us. And so I believe that the way to be resilient is to maintain your relationship holders. And if you can keep the same people guiding those relationships, be it with landowners or federal partners or state partners or other nonprofits like Deb's, if we can retain those people, we're going to have a lot of resilience regardless of what kind of external changes happen around us.
Yeah, great. Coming back to the people. Sharon, and maybe you're going to say the same thing based on what you've just talked to us about, how important people are in stewardship. But, obviously, there are huge impacts going on. And you talked about California, climate change accelerating, changes to social movements, globally, obviously changes to government and policy. So with all of that You said California's a unique place to be, pushing against the tide. What have been some of the unique initiatives that you've been able to deliver that have tackled the barriers to collaborative conservation or unlocked these new opportunities? And how does stewardship really help that? And you're on mute.
Such a great question. I was so entranced by your question. First of all, +1 to what Chet said, it is about relationships. It's about trust. And then speaking to what you addressed, one of the things we're seeing is those relationships that Chet spoke to, those abilities to create really meaningful partnerships on the ground, across sectors, across landscapes, as they expand and become more able to do work at scale, there's some things that they need to enable them to continue to do that work, to not limit that. And so that's where our network has focused a lot of its initiatives. We've spent time working with other partners on stewardship workforce. I mean, the fact that we, for a collaborative conservation, don't have a workforce large enough to address, the wildfire resilience and forest health work, the work of just basically maintaining and sustaining stewardship activities across public and private lands, that's a huge limitation, a huge barrier. So how can we, as networks of networks and other partners, work with the state to help address some of that? One of the larger areas we've focused is that it takes time and it takes capacity and it takes resources to work in this way at these scales. And if we're going to address in a more durable approach the social and environmental challenges and opportunities you spoke to, how can we do that in a way that not only brings benefit to those of us in California, but brings benefit beyond? And Deb and I talk a lot about this, is how do we take the moment in time where California is more resourced and has stronger leadership in certain areas to bring greater benefit nationally? So one initiative that we're working a lot on is how do we create new funding streams, modify existing funding streams, but bring language and demonstrated research and data to indicate why funders, why policymakers, why agencies should continue to provide funding and support to enable capacity building for these collaborations. And what I mean by that is when we first convened 10 years ago, and we went around the room and we're talking to ecologists, when we asked the number one limiting factor for working in partnership across these landscapes, it was the capacity to work in a new way. It takes time, it takes attention, it takes resources. So we've focused our work on doing research, creating papers, meeting with state leaders, looking at grant guidelines, all those things that may not seem as sexy to, for example, restoring a riparian corridor, restoring a floodplain. They are essential to enable that collaborative approach. That's where we have focused a lot of time and attention. We've focused convenings around it. And more recently, Jody, we've been able to undertake research with 125 collaboratives across the country, including many that Deb works with, to develop for the first time a data-driven model that shows that relationship by those investments in capacity yield accelerated impacts on the ground from a stewardship outcome perspective. And we hope to publish that in the next 2 months. But it's those things, it's unlocking what may not seem like a big barrier in a way that then enables all that action, control fire, all those things that we need to do as good stewards of the land to be able to work in this way.
Yeah, it's partnerships. You've all really touched on that, and again, congratulations on that work, and looking forward to seeing more of that. But partnerships is something that you've all touched on. Through my Churchill study, I observed a great opportunity in strengthening partnerships, collaborations with Indigenous groups, private entities, and government organisations that offer opportunities for so much mutual benefit. And partnerships, and I think you've touched on this, that can enhance resource availability, diversity expertise, build broad community support. I think it's something that we won't have time to dive more deeply into in our discussion today, but it's certainly something that each of you have talked to as a critical enabling factor to driving some of the outcomes that we're all trying to achieve. Unfortunately, Madeline Bettenkamp from the Ramapo-Munsee Land Alliance wasn't able to join our conversation today, but from my discussions with her and with other Indigenous people across Canada and the US that I engage with through my study tour, with regards to those enabling factors that are specific to Indigenous groups, what was evident at the time that I was there, obviously things, continue to rapidly change, was that to support Indigenous-led conservation, and I just want to share some of these reflections because Madeline wasn't here to join the conversation, and I obviously can't speak on behalf of her just from the conversations I had while I was overseas, but that there are opportunities to expand and demonstrate, for example, co-management, land return models, and Indigenous governance. And these things are opportunities for organisations to lean more deeply into and for governments and philanthropy to continue to support. That expanding direct Indigenous access to conservation funding is a crucial pathway to some of these outcomes. And philanthropy and government can invest more in Indigenous-led initiatives, considering the role of intermediaries and scale and capacity building programs that empower Indigenous organisations to manage large-scale projects. And these are all important in the context of these enabling factors that allow us to do all of our work. And you've all touched to an extent on the different partnerships that you have in that space. So one final question to you all, just to round this out, because we have talked about things moving and shifting and building resilient organisations, but I'd really, like to know and understand in the context of the changes we're seeing right around the globe, global politics and war, economic downturns, changing community sentiments, increasing impacts of climate change. They're affecting our daily lives. And, on ground collaborative work can sometimes feel challenging, but it's also one of the most rewarding careers on the planet. And I can see that in your faces when you talk about the work that you do. So how do you as an individual maintain resilience? And what advice do you give others who are on the ground delivering impact for nature and the communities that steward it? Let's go, Chet, you first.
Thanks, Jody. It's a good question. And I think I'm proud to say that in some ways, I believe I don't even have a job. When you love what you do so much, it's rewarding just to go to work. So I think I'm setting a good example for my kids in that I don't slog off to work each day. I sort of bounce off to this opportunity. That doesn't mean it's not easy. That doesn't mean it's not hard. And so what I would say is look at the image behind Sharon, look at the image behind you, Jody, look at the images that I shared. And these are the places that we get to impact. And I've spent time in both of those locations and I know them well. And so for me, when I'm low, I have to get out. I have to feel it. I have to touch it. I have to remember why I'm there. And it doesn't take long when you spend time in these places, in these parks, to realize the importance. And so for me, my favorite thing to do 2 or 3 times a year, I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I can be inside Yellowstone by 6 a.m. as the sun is rising. I can see wolves and bears in their natural habitat doing their natural things, and I can be home by noon and fully recharged for another month's worth of great work. And that's a little bit of a road warrior. Get there and get back, but it's remarkable to be so close to these places that are so valuable to the entire globe, and to have a hand in their conservation is pretty rewarding.
I can see absolutely why you do that, Chet. I drove through this valley behind me to get to where you're talking about, and it's just magnificent. If I could get up at 4 a.m. and get there every day, I would. Sharon, you're off mute. What about you?
Sure. So for me, I go to something that we've already talked about. I've actually kind of shifted from a lot of my national thinking to the local level, because that's where I feel like I can have those meaningful relationships in a very different way. It's place-based. So I've spent time with that. And just like Chet, getting outside and connecting with people. I've taken up outdoor swimming again. And for the first time since my son was 15, fast forward 10 years, we're going backpacking next year together. So things like that. And honestly, this may sound odd. I'm originally from England. I'm getting my media now from Europe. I'm not reading very much that comes in our own country. I've turned down any kind of social media. And that's more so just to regulate because we're constantly being fed information. So like, how do we ground truth it? How do we digest it in a way that doesn't take away the sense of joy, the sense of hope, the sense of connection we have?
Beautiful. Thanks, Sharon. Deb.
I could echo both of theirs. I'm definitely spending time out in the landscapes that I either live in or I'm lucky enough to travel to and work with folks. But I think I'll emphasize people. I find folks who are drawn to this kind of work, particularly collaborative conservation, are leaning in really hard right now and trying to find solutions, think differently, move beyond the crisis into the solution, like what comes next. And I was with Sharon and Shawnee last week, and being with a group of 20 of us who work on building capacity across the country for locally led efforts gives me a lot of hope. So I think for like, if we're sharing advice, I think it's remembering you're not alone in this work, and that there's a lot of us doing this kind of work, and hopefully you can find some kind of network where you can be part of something bigger, a cohort where you can share ideas and learn from one another. Because and I guess that I'll just add one other too, for us as a global organization and really working with partners all over. It's part of it is we're watching things. Like, I love the idea of not everyone reinventing the wheel, and so how can we ensure that there's best practices shared? That gives me hope. And like organizations like ILCN or Sharon's network or the networks we're part of give me a lot of hope for that. Like, again, it's like you're not alone. How can we learn from one another? And how can we also just have some fun and joy sometimes too, which is what we really need right now.
Yeah.
So people are, I'll just say that's my, that gives me, like, spending time with good colleagues is really key right now.
Yeah.
Like you guys.
Fantastic.
So
Yeah. Well, I was going to say exactly the same thing, Deb. Just fantastic. That global network, local networks. It all comes to people and how we can collectively do this together. Such an insightful conversation. Thank you to each of you for your, for sharing your challenges, your successes, the things that you're unlocking to scale the work that you're doing, and ultimately the impacts that you're having for the environment and the communities who steward it. I want to thank you for your time and giving us hope and inspiration as we head off into the day or the evening or the afternoon, depending on where we're coming from. There's some 30-odd countries from around the world joining us here. And especially, as we've said, given the environmental, political and social challenges affecting our everyday work. This conversation really brings to life the key findings from the Churchill Fellowship study tour that I had. And I just want to highlight a couple of those that reflect this conversation, but the broader conversations I had. So conservation easements in the US have been highly effective in protecting ecologically significant lands while allowing continued landholder use. Land trusts play a critical role in facilitating conservation agreements, providing stewardship support, and mobilising financial incentives for conservation. Indigenous communities across America are increasingly leading conservation efforts, integrating traditional ecological knowledge with contemporary science, and we have a lot more work to do in this area. Non-Indigenous organisations have a responsibility to amplify and build more long-term, trust-based partnerships and effective collaborative arrangements. In doing so, recognising that this will require patience, cultural understanding, and a commitment to Indigenous leadership. Collaborative networks and coalitions illustrate the power of regional-scale conservation efforts, aligning stakeholders to achieve large-scale conservation outcomes. And finally, the protection of wildlife corridors and the construction of road crossing structures demonstrates the effectiveness of infrastructure and conservation in mitigating habitat fragmentation. The projects that I experienced, those that you've heard of today, these offer valuable lessons for many of us around the world. And I'm so grateful to the Caroline Welsh and to the Winston Churchill Trust of Australia for providing me the opportunity to complete the study tour that has allowed me to share these insights with the world. I'd like to thank as well the International Land Conservation Network for creating the space and the platform for individuals like ourselves to come together to address collective global challenges. And one of the ways that the International Land Conservation Network does this is through hosting a global congress every 3 years. I'm thrilled that the Australian Land Conservation Alliance will host the next International Land Conservation Network Global Congress here in Australia. You've got some time to plan. It's in October 2027. So book your flights now. Tickets aren't on sale yet, but they will be soon enough. Thanks to all of you who have joined this or any of the other 2 webinars through the series from right around the world across more than 40 countries, hundreds of registrations to this webinar. So thank you for your work. It's important and it's helping to build a shared future for all life on Earth. Have a nice rest of the day or evening. Farewell.